It's the slavery era, and one of the white elite gentlemen of the city has died. He owned thousands of slaves who worked in his plantations, spread all across the city. He had to do nothing and had hired tens of overseers who managed everything for him. Every month his wealth increased because he did not have to pay slaves for their labor. He owned them. But now he is dead. He had no children who could be in charge except for his loyal wife. From now on, she will take care of everything, and all his husband's wealth and property will be hers. She seems sad, and other elite white gentlemen of the city are thinking of marrying her. She is beautiful, besides being wealthy. However, she has different plans. 1 week after his husband's death, she goes to the plantations to see how everything is run. But once she goes there, she is completely surprised to see how strong and attractive black male slaves work there. The next day, she goes to the slave market and buys 10 young and strong black male slaves. What will she do to them? What lustful and forbidden plans does she have?
The Black History Archives.
Similar records can be found in books like The Plantation Mistress, Woman's World in the Old South by Catherine Clinton and Within the Plantation Households by Elizabeth Fox Genovese. Widowed white women in the South were often left to manage large estates and oversee the daily operations of the plantation. This new role as the head of the household, combined with the emotional void left by the death of a husband, made some widows susceptible to the temptation of engaging in sexual relationships with their slaves. Unlike married women, widows had the freedom to avoid the constraints of another marriage, a union that would once again place them under the control of a man. Instead, they could indulge in forbidden relationships, driven by a mix of unmet sexual desires and the intoxicating power they held over the black male slaves. These illicit affairs were a blatant violation of the social and racial norms of the time. White women were expected to remain pure and untainted by interactions with black male slaves who were considered racially inferior. Engaging in a sexual relationship with a black slave was seen as a betrayal of their race and the social order. However, for these widows, the thrill of the forbidden, combined with the deep emotional and physical void they felt, often proved irresistible. These relationships were rarely consensual. Enslaved black men were at the mercy of their mistresses' whims, with no power to resist or refuse. The encounters often began with the widow summoning a slave to her private quarters under the pretext of needing assistance with a household task. Once alone, the situation would quickly escalate into a sexual encounter, with the widow using her authority to compel the slave to fulfill her desires. Some of these relationships were marked by repeated and regular encounters, where the widow would establish a routine of summoning the same slave to her chambers. And one can imagine what happened behind closed doors. There was no fear of the white husband coming back and seeing what the white woman was engaging in. These sessions were not simply about sexual gratification, but also about control and domination. The widows derived a perverse sense of power from their ability to command and exploit the bodies of their slaves. In the book Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacobs describes how white women, particularly widows, would manipulate and coerce their male slaves into sexual relationships. Although Jacobs writes primarily from the perspective of enslaved women, her accounts reveal the complex and often sinister dynamics that could exist between white mistresses and their slaves. The relationships were characterized by a mix of lust, power, and cruelty, with the mistresses using their sexual dominance as a means to assert control over their households and their slaves. For many of these widowed mistresses, the affairs were as much about power as they were about sexual desire. The thrill of controlling and dominating a black man, combined with the transgressive nature of the relationship, provided a powerful sex drive. These women were defying the very norms that had confined them to subservient roles throughout their lives. And this felt good. It gave a pre-pleasure before the main course. Here's a reminder to please support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving the video a like. We want to build a strong community, and we need your support. Let's continue now. The historian Catherine Clinton, in her book, The Plantation Mistress, Woman's World in the Old South, explores how these relationships were a way for white women to assert their power in a society that gave them little autonomy. Clinton argues that while these women were oppressed by the patriarchal structures of their society, they found in their relationships with black men a perverse form of liberation, one that allowed them to exert control over those even more powerless than themselves. The nature of these relationships was deeply influenced by the setting in which they occurred. Plantation houses were large, often with many secluded rooms and quarters where these sexual encounters could take place away from the prying eyes of other slaves or household staff. A widow might summon a slave to her private quarters under the pretense of needing help with a household task, only to engage in sexual activities once they were alone. The physical spaces of the plantation, bedrooms, private sitting rooms, or even the widow's late husband's study, became the very place for these secretive encounters. These encounters were not just about sexual gratification, but also about asserting dominance. The widow, deprived of her husband's authority, would exert her will over the slave, using him to fulfill her needs while maintaining the veneer of respectability in public. This duality, public chastity and private indulgence, was a hallmark of these relationships, creating a tense and often dangerous dynamic for the enslaved man. The psychological impact of these relationships on both the widow and the slave was profound. For the widow, these sexual relationships were a way to cope with the loneliness and grief of widowhood, but they also came with feelings of guilt and fear of discovery. The knowledge that they were breaking social taboos and risking their reputation created a sense of internal conflict, which could manifest in erratic behavior, ranging from bouts of affection to sudden outbursts of cruelty towards the slave. For the enslaved men, these relationships were deeply traumatic. The sexual encounters were not consensual in the true sense. The slaves were coerced by the power their mistresses wielded over them. The constant threat of punishment, combined with the emotional manipulation often employed by the widows, left these men in a state of perpetual fear and confusion. While the sexual exploitation of black slaves by white women was not uncommon on southern plantations, the dynamics of these relationships differed significantly when the mistress was a widow. The absence of a male authority figure in the household created a unique power vacuum that the widow sought to fill through her relationships with slaves. Unlike married women who might have engaged in such sexual relationships out of curiosity or boredom, widows often did so out of a deeper sense of need, both sexual and emotional. The secrecy of these relationships was also more pronounced in the case of widows. With no husband to provide a buffer or to protect them from the consequences of such a scandal, widows had to be extraordinarily careful in managing these affairs. This secrecy added an element of danger and excitement to the relationships, but also intensified the psychological toll on both parties. In many cases, the relatives and friends of widowed white women were not completely unaware of the sexual dynamics unfolding within the confines of their large estates. These social circles often had a clear understanding of the widow's life after her husband's death, particularly when it involved the acquisition of new slaves, especially young and physically strong black men. The purchase and close placement of these slaves within the household or near the widow's private quarters often raised suspicions among those in her social network. It was commonly known that these widowed women, now in control of their estates, had both the means and opportunity to engage in relationships that would have been considered scandalous and taboo if brought to light. However, the close-knit nature of Southern society meant that while these actions were often suspected or even known, they were seldom openly discussed. The prevailing racial and gender hierarchies provided these women with a layer of respectability that was rarely questioned, even when their behavior clearly transgressed societal norms. Friends, relatives, and other members of the elite white society were keenly aware of the powerful and isolating emotions these widowed women faced: loneliness, grief, and unfulfilled desires. They understood that these women might seek comfort and satisfaction in ways that defied the conventional expectations of remarriage or celibacy. The acquisition of new, attractive black male slaves by these widows was often seen as a sign of their intentions, even if these interpretations were rarely spoken aloud. In many Southern communities, there was an unspoken understanding and a culture of silence surrounding the private lives of widowed women. This was partly due to societal norms that discouraged the public airing of private affairs, particularly those involving sexual relations between white women and black men. The idea that a widowed white woman would engage in sexual relationships with her slaves was scandalous, but it was also something that many chose to ignore or avoid addressing directly. Historians like Stephanie E. Jones Rogers in her book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, and Catherine Clinton in The Plantation, Mistress, Woman's World in the Old South, offer historical context suggesting that relationships between white women and their slaves, while not always publicly discussed, were often suspected or known within the community. The stories of these relationships have largely been silenced in historical narratives, overshadowed by the more visible atrocities of slavery. However, they are an essential part of understanding the complexities of plantation life and the ways in which power, race, and gender intersected in the most intimate aspects of life. Isn't it true that this part of Black history and slavery has never been told? What do you think? Why do they hide these historical records? Is it to avoid embarrassment? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts about today where if white women are asked about their first choice, without thinking about their family, they would prefer black men. Would you like us to make more videos? If yes, please support us by subscribing to the Black History Archives and clicking the bell icon. You can check out more videos on our channel too.